Hello. Well, I'm back, and this time we'll be talking about Chapter 4 in Maurizio that features Demeter and Hades. And like all the chapters just about that deal with the gods, one is going to get dealt with more than the other. Since Demeter and Hades sort of share a story together, Hades, who is the one who gets sort of ignored in this chapter, does get some time. So the main thing in the section in the beginning where she talks about Hades, she's largely talking about Hades' kingdom. And the point I really want to emphasize is that the view of Hades changes from Homer's Odyssey 11. That's the oldest account we have in Greek material about the underworld. In Book 11, Odysseus travels to the edge of the world. Now remember, the Greeks of Homer and Hesiod's time thought that the world was a disk surrounded by the river ocean. Atop it was a bowl that was the sky, and below it was a bowl that was Tartarus. So if you go to the edge of the world, then of course you're at the point where sky and underworld and earth are the closest, right? So that would be the place where ghosts presumably could come up more easily. And that's sort of what happens in Book 11. So he doesn't really go to the underworld. But the underworld is presented, the afterlife is presented basically as this dull, gray existence that the ghosts aren't fully aware of what's going on. They're listless. They don't have a lot of energy, that type of thing. And for Homer, and at least in the Odyssey, the whole thing seems to be life's where it's at. Life's what matters, and you want to spend your time focusing on life, because the land of the dead, there's nothing there. There's no glorious afterlife. Now that idea changes over time, so that you end up getting at some point the idea of individual judgment. In other words, you die, you go before a tribunal, rather like, appearing at the gates before St. Peter, and you were judged on your life. And if you've been judged as having a good life, you go to the Elysian Fields. If you're judged to have had a bad life, you're sentenced to Tartarus, or hell, the equivalent of hell. And it might be time related. In other words, you might get a sentence of a certain time depending how bad you were. There may also be reincarnation, which comes up with some authors. You also get a much more elaborate geography of the underworld, so that it eventually has 5 rivers. The main river is the River Styx that you cross. When you die, you cross the River Styx in a boat that is piloted by a man named Charon. But there are other rivers: the River Acheron, the River Phlegethon, the River Cocytus, and the River Lethe. Those are the other rivers in the underworld. So that changes over time. But Homer doesn't seem to know any of that stuff. For him, it's just this shadowy non-existence. Okay, the main literary work in chapter 4 is Homeric hymn number 2 to Demeter, which tells the story of the rape, the kidnapping of Persephone. Now, a word about Homeric hymns. So the ancients believed these were by Homer. They have a Homeric style. It is almost certain that none of the Homeric hymns are by Homer. It is 100% sure that most of them, if some people might say 1 or 2 might be, the rest are definitely not. So, and I'd say there aren't that many people who believe that any are by Homer. But the term sticks, and so we still refer to them as the Homeric hymns. And the edition that was, that from the ancient world or from the early medieval world that we have of the hymns, they're in a particular order, and this happens to be number 2. So we keep that numbering as well. So this tells the story of how Hades wanted to marry Persephone. He worked out a deal with Zeus, and then he kidnapped Persephone after she had been out picking flowers. The earth opens up. He grabs her, drags her down to the underworld. Demeter goes into a panic, tries to find her daughter, cannot find her daughter, finds out what happens, and then in effect goes into exile from the gods for maybe a couple years. She spends some of that time disguised as an old woman, and she acts as the nurse to the prince of Eleusis, named Demophon, and tries to make him immortal, probably to replace the daughter that she lost. She's interrupted in doing that, and so that does not happen. And then she causes a worldwide famine for a year, and finally Zeus tells Hermes to go tell Hades he has to release Persephone. He does so, but not before he gives her some pomegranate seeds to eat. And because she's eaten something in the underworld, she cannot be above ground like for a full year. She has to spend some of the year down in the underworld with Hades, who now basically has become her husband. Now, the bit about the pomegranate seeds, what's going on with the pomegranate seeds? Well, the pomegranate seeds have a blood red quality. If you've ever eaten pomegranate seeds, they're sort of tart, and they're blood red. And the suggestion is what it represents is the first sexual union. So when a girl becomes a woman after having had sexual union with a man, again, this is going to be pretty conventional as far as the pairings go. Something's different, right? Her hymen is broken, and usually there's some blood, and that's sort of what this is symbolic of. So the fact that she ate these pomegranate seeds is suggestive that she actually had sex with Hades, and therefore is no longer her mother's daughter, but also her husband's wife. Okay, so another thing that gets mentioned in the first part of chapter 4 is the Eleusinian mysteries. These were annual mysteries. They were held in late September, early October. So right around the time of the vernal equinox, and a little bit after that. It was a 9-day festival. The first 4 days took place in Athens. There was a 1-day parade to Eleusis, which is about 14 miles away. And then there was a couple days of stuff at Eleusis. Then there was the culminating event that took place in this hall called the Telesterion. And the Telesterion is sort of unique as a temple because most temples are the homes of the gods, and humans don't really go in there. They sort of appreciate it from outside. But the Telesterion was basically like a hall, and presumably it was a hall that for most of the time you were in there, it was dark. But some revelation gets made there that supposedly changes people's view of things and changes their lives. The Eleusinian mysteries were a big deal. To be an initiate in the mysteries, and by the way, that's what a mystery religion is, one where only the initiates know the full scope of the religious practice. But to be an initiate was a big deal. I mean, consider it something like confirmation in the Catholic Church, right? You become a sort of a member in full standing when that happens, when you're confirmed. But this is even more so the case because not everyone participated in the Eleusinian mysteries. Supposedly, it preached something about the connection of life and death, and that when the initiates died, they had Persephone as someone who had their back in the underworld. So in other words, the afterlife was not scary because they had an inside connection. Something along that line seems to be what was going on with the Eleusinian mysteries. The Homeric hymn number 2 appears to be the script that was used, or similar a script that was used at the Eleusinian mysteries. So in all likelihood, probably in Athens, the Homeric hymn number 2 was performed. It would take about 40 minutes to an hour to perform. So it would be performed, and then that would serve as sort of the blueprint for the rituals that you'd go through. So then as you did the ritual things, you'd remember back to the hymn. And some people, of course, would do these, on a regular basis. Every few years they'd go to Eleusis. Certainly people who lived in Athens could do this because Eleusis is nearby. One last thing. When the Eleusinian Mysteries were held for the month of September and the month of October, and those names were not the names of the months for the ancient Greeks, but those 2 months were, any war that was going on ceased during that time period, so that, especially like civil wars between Greek city-states, so that any Greek-speaking person could travel to Eleusis in peace to participate in the mysteries. The scholarship of chapter 4 is part of an article by Helene Foley called A Question of Origins. She is going to take the position that myth supports the status quo. So one of the things that happens with Homeric Hymn number 2 is that some people read it as a criticism of patriarchal society. Foley suggests that while there are things in there that could be read as critical of patriarchal society, that in fact myth generally does not criticize the status quo but does something to support it. And so she says you can look in the hymn and there are signs of support, right? Everyone is sort of behind this idea of the kidnapping of Persephone. Even Helios, the sun god that tells Demeter that her daughter has been taken by Hades, basically frames it in terms of like, I understand you're upset, but don't be overly upset because, hey, Hades is a bridegroom, you could do worse, right? So that's Helios's argument. Zeus, of course, is in on it, and according to the Greek practice, if the father and the groom basically made the arrangements, and then the bride and the mother of the bride had to sort of go along with that. Now, personally, I think that it is likely that most fathers did take into account their daughter's thoughts and also their wives' thoughts before making a choice. In other words, they didn't just make a decision and then you were stuck with it. But the point is, legally they could do that. Women had no legal rights, and so that was certainly within the power of the father to do that. And so we see that in the poem. And it turns out in a way okay for Persephone from the perspective of she gains social position. She gains a position independent of her mother. She has a role as Queen of the Dead, so she gets some sort of honor and respect in that position. And Demeter gets this big complex at Eleusis, which she orders to be built in that year that she puts famine on the earth. She demands that they build this big temple, and so Eleusis actually does that. So again, that sort of sets up the status quo of the Eleusinian Mysteries. So at any rate, Foley, it's worth reading because she's basically, when the piece came out, my guess is it was seen as something of a bombshell because a lot of the standard thinking was that clearly this represents a pre-Indo-European, matriarchal society, or society at least it's not patriarchal with a goddess at the center. But then you have the imposition of the patriarchal Indo-Europeans taking over, and this is clearly done, in resistance to that. Foley argues that there actually is no strong evidence that that is the case. I mean, not that that's not a worthy goal, but that actually is not supported by the evidence that we have. And then finally, I want to talk about the comparison piece. This is a Sumerian poem. It seems to go back to the 18th century BCE, so it's a lot older than any Greek literature we have. The earliest that we have, whether it's Homer or Hesiod, certainly goes back no further than 750 BCE, maybe closer to 700. So it's almost 1,000 years. Well, it is about 1,000 years after this. This is how the poem begins: in the desert by the early grass, and it deals with this mother goddess figure named Dutur and her son Dumuzi. So this is a parallel story to what we have in the story of Demeter and Persephone. But that's a mother-daughter, this is a mother-son, and by the way, that's the more usual pattern, either mother-son or mother-love or goddess-lover, where the male figure dies and then the female figure then does something to try to resurrect the one who's gone away. It's unclear whether Dutter is entirely successful, but it is tied with some sort of ritual practice, because at the end of the selection here we have the Song of the Reviving Beer, and apparently one of the things that was part of this ritual of Dutter and Dumuzi was there was a beer fest, and there was this Song of the Reviving Beer, and you can see where alcohol would have some sort of effect that could lead someone to believe that it's actually like infusing you with life, right? So that therefore it could raise someone from the dead would be the idea. But there are some interesting things. Dutter actually travels to the underworld. That is not what Demeter does not actually go to the underworld. There seems to be a barrier. She doesn't do that. But here we do have the goddess actually traveling to the underworld. And it's very strange. So when you read it, make sure you look at those marginal comments. Those are like sort of summary points by the translator. They help a lot in figuring out what's going on. All right. So that's all I'm going to say for chapter 4, and I'll see you again for chapter 5.